Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Amanda Shee. I'm an anesthesiologist and intensivist, and today I want to talk about some of my failures and rejections and some of the lessons I learned from those experiences. I think in the modern day, with social media so prevalent and all of us constantly doom scrolling through our various channels, we oftentimes see a highlight reel of people's lives. So we see the good, the best, the shiny moments in people's lives, but oftentimes we don't get to see some of the lows and some of the failures, rejections, and some of the really significant challenges that each of us have gone through. I definitely have encountered my own fair share of rejections and failures along the way, and today I wanted to focus on a couple of specific kind of career-related rejections and failures and some of those lessons that I learned from them. And those lessons are lessons that I still take with me all the way up until now. So the first failure / rejection that I wanted to talk about was when I was transferring colleges from a tiny liberal arts college to the University of Michigan. I asked a number of my professors for letters of recommendation in order to transfer, and I noticed that when I was applying for transfer, that the acceptances that I received from colleges were all ones that did not require letters of recommendation. So it seemed a little odd, but at the time I felt like it must have been something in my application, or it must be that I wasn't a good fit for some of those institutions, and I ended up transferring to the University of Michigan. It worked out really well, but when I went back to ask one of my professors for another letter of recommendation for medical school, that's when I actually found out that I had received a lukewarm letter of recommendation when I had initially applied to transfer colleges. Now, at the time, I felt betrayed and I felt confused as to why any professor would sabotage a student or would not honestly just sit down with me and say that they had concerns about my maturity or about me as a student, and instead just go behind my back and write a letter that wasn't the best possible letter that I could get. It was, I think, a learning point for both myself and for my professor that, one, the thing that I really learned from that was that anytime you're going to ask for a letter of recommendation, you absolutely need to sit down with the person and look them in the eye and ask if they can write you a positive letter of recommendation or a glowing letter of recommendation. And if they have any reservations, that they should let you know, because it is your candidacy for various schools or positions or things like that. And you want to make sure that the people who are recommending you or representing you actually have your best interests at heart. So that's something that was a really big lesson for me. And ever since I'd learned about that, I make a point anytime I've asked my letter writers about if they have any concerns about my candidacy, if they would be able to write a positive, and I definitely emphasize the word positive, letter of recommendation on my behalf. That was a really hard lesson for me to learn, and I ended up learning it maybe about a decade ago now, but overall, I'll say that in my career and in anyone's career over time, you're going to be constantly applying for new positions and roles and need references and letters. And it's important that this type of thing is made clear ahead of time and that you're comfortable with making sure to ask for the best possible recommendation or reference that you can. The second thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of failures and rejections was my medical school application process. So I applied to over 20 medical schools. One of the lessons that I'd really learned from that was that I applied way too late, and that in itself was an issue, but I had applied to over 20 places and I actually only got 3 acceptances. And at the end of the day, what I will say is that all it takes is one acceptance to a school, a professional school, or whatever it is that you're applying for, in order for you to be able to move forward with your career. But at the time when I was going through the process of applying to medical school, all I could think of was, I'm such a failure, I'm never gonna be able to be a doctor, no one wants me, etc., etc. And it was, at the time, it seemed like the end of the world that I wasn't getting all of these acceptances and didn't didn't have all of these options to choose from. And it made me feel like, reflecting back, that I wasn't good enough in some way, shape, or form. But the reality is medical school admissions and a lot of professional school admissions processes are in a lot of ways based on luck and a number of other factors that are really out of your control. And looking back, I ended up exactly where I needed to be in order to be as successful as I needed to be. And I think that that's an important lesson that I kind of had to take away from that, was that all that really matters is that you move forward from the process and that you don't compare yourself to others, or you don't ask or dwell on what ifs and things that could have been, when in reality what's is currently. And so I think that that's something that was really important for me to have to learn, is to move on from the rejections, because at the end of the day, they don't matter. In fact, most of the rejections I got from medical schools, I've totally forgotten about at this point in my career, since I'm done and I'm attending and I'm happy. The third thing I wanted to talk about in terms of failures and rejections was actually a failure of an exam that I took in medical school. Now, anyone who goes to professional school is pretty type A. We typically have really, really strong GPAs and a really good record in terms of transcripts and test taking. And I thought that in a lot of ways that I was invincible going into medical school, that yes, I already knew how to study, so clearly I would get through medical school fine. And what I found was I was surprised by the fact that for my second medical school exam ever, that I just failed it. I totally failed it. I mean, it was a huge disappointment that I faced when I found out I had failed. I wondered if I was cut out for medical school when I realized that I had failed the exam. I started to question my own intelligence. I started to question my abilities. And ultimately, what I took away from all of that was that I had to acknowledge that what I was doing for that exam was just not enough, and that was that reality. So the way I had studied for that exam was inefficient, and I needed a new plan. So I had to take the time to acknowledge that I had failed. I had to take the time to acknowledge that what I had done wasn't working, but I also had to accept the fact that these types of challenges will happen, and that they are a way to force yourself to think about and reflect how you can do better and what you can change in order to approach the situation in a different way. So what I had to do is change the way that I studied completely. I had to also acknowledge the fact that I hadn't studied as much as I probably should have for this exam, and that the way that I was doing it, which at that time was very passive, I just looked at slides and read them and somehow thought that via osmosis in the computer screen that I would be able to absorb all of the information, but clearly that didn't work out that way. So I think that that was really important for me, because it has really been able to shape the way that I've studied for future exams. And luckily, I hope, totally done with examinations since I have finished the board certification process. So I definitely learned something from that experience. The fourth thing that I wanted to go over was when I had run for a leadership position on a national organization that I was really passionate about. And what I will say is that when I ran for the position, the way that the elections worked, you were able to run for a position and also kind of run for a secondary one. So if we ran for the executive board, we could also run for another kind of chair position. And what I realized when I went for it was that, well, first and foremost, because I'm talking about failures and rejections, I clearly didn't get elected into the position that I had wanted to get, but I ended up getting my backup position, which was as conference chair for this organization. Looking back, it worked out the way that it should have in my mind. I had an incredible experience planning the conference, and it's to the point now where this organization I'm a part of, I am planning the 9th conference or 8th or 9th conference I've ever planned, and next year would be 10 years that I've been part of planning this organization's conferences. And so it's definitely something that I enjoy. It's something that I continue to do to this day. But looking back, one of the things that I learned from this experience was that I shouldn't or in general, when going for positions or going for things that are elected, I think it's really important that you demonstrate that you have a commitment to that specific position rather than having like a backup plan, which I'm very conservative. So conservative in the way that I always like to have some sort of backup plan. I always like to make sure that I have thought everything through and that I will not end up empty-handed in some way or end up stranded in some way or surprised by things. And I felt like that strategy actually worked against me in the setting of this election because it didn't really demonstrate that I was passionate about this one leadership position that I was going for, whereas the person who ended up getting elected only ran for one position. It was that position alone. So I think that that was something that I have continued to reflect back on and continue to use that information as I have been running for different positions or have been applying for different leadership or new job opportunities, that I really demonstrate a commitment to that particular path that I'm applying for. And then finally, the fifth thing I wanted to talk about was actually something I did more recently. I applied for a administrative fellowship at one point a few years ago, and clearly I did not get it because I would be talking about it if I did. And I remember when I had received the rejection letter that I was really disappointed, like, oh, I guess I'm not what they're looking for, or there's something about my resume that wasn't good enough for this particular position. And I ended up starting my job as a full-time attending anesthesiologist and intensivist. And what I'll say is that this last year and a half has been amazing. There's a lot of lessons learned that I have gone through. I feel so much clinically stronger. I feel like I have made a lot of really great connections and built a lot of really great relationships that I actually would not have been able to do through this fellowship because it would have reduced my clinical time. So in a lot of ways, I do think it was a blessing in disguise. I think that the other big thing that I took away from not getting this or being rejected from this program was that there are other opportunities that will arise. There will always be other opportunities that arise. And sometimes those opportunities might end up being a better fit for my goals or just where I'm at in life than what I had anticipated I had wanted prior to that. So I think that not getting something when you apply for it sometimes just means that you will open the door to future unforeseen opportunities. Okay, so those were 5 failures / rejections that I went through and some of the lessons that I learned from them. I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this video. Have you personally had some rejections or failures that were similar to mine? What have you learned from them? Let me know in the comments, and thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, give me a thumbs up. If you want to hear more from me, please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next time.